The religious and the atheist fundamentally think about the world in different ways. So, an atheist might go to church and accept a lesson, a moral lesson or perspective on the world on the basis of faith. Broadly speaking, atheists like myself will typically lean towards science. And the example I always go to when talking about this is Newton and Einstein. So when Einstein came out and said that Newton's theories were inadequate in describing the whole of physics as we understood it, it kind of broke down once you got up to higher speeds. It's perfectly fine physics for when you're down here on Earth, but it didn't explain everything that we could see, and it left a lot of holes. So Einstein came along and said, hey, I have this theory, uh, and I think general theory of relativity, special theory of relativity, and more. And he wasn't cast out, I should, or he wasn't thought of as a false prophet or as a heretic. You know, instead, his theories were reviewed and published, and it wasn't until after they were proven and tested, or tested and proven to be true, to finally explain things in reality that we could observe and we could test for. He was then hailed as a genius. And I think that's sort of the fundamental difference between people who think about the world in a way like I do, where um, if you want to prove that, if you want to come out and say that Newton is wrong, go ahead. It's on you then to prove that. And once you've done so, and many other people have tested your work to make sure that it is true, then you'll be celebrated as a hero. It's no problem, to people who think about the world from a scientific basis, discovering new information that proves old information wrong or inadequate isn't really a problem for us. It's just like, oh, okay, time to update our knowledge base. This is the new standard now that we have proven this beyond a shadow of a doubt, which is why Einstein is so widely regarded as a world class genius, one of the greatest minds in human history. Because he came along and he said, hey, there's more to this universe than we currently have explained. I have now written down my explanations for it. Go ahead and test and see if I'm right. Whereas the religious don't really take that approach, owing to the fact that they have typically thousands of years, a religious text from thousands of years ago that they still read and they say is applicable to our modern lives. In my opinion, some of it, some moral lessons that you can draw from it could be applicable to modern lives, but that's only because those are in my opinion, the broadest possible morals you can really draw from. Killing people is bad, don't steal, pretty basic ABCs of morality that I think that mankind has spent, centuries going over the whole history of philosophy, really diving into ethics and what does it mean to be moral and good. Um, but what I'm talking about is how they fundamentally view the world differently. So it's like I was inspired for this discussion with talks I've had with people over fake news. Because both a religious person and an atheist can understand that either a source of information, whether that come from a respectable person or a government official or a news organization or uh, or some other source. Everyone is capable of recognizing the possibility that the information they receive from somewhere could be wrong. but the differences between the religious and the, I guess I should stop saying atheist, maybe scientific, or I don't know, people like me who tend to lean for more evidence-based things, who tend to be the type of people who will look that thing up and do a little bit of reading before talking on it, or talking confidently on it. I know I personally don't really like ever being forced to defend or explain something that I don't fully understand, and I'll usually either stay silent or let it to be known, hey, I'm ignorant on this subject. I'm not really going to say anything foundational until I've done my reading, or I've thought about it for a while, and I have something I feel worthwhile saying. And that's kind of the difference that I have observed. So when I see that someone in the world has made a claim that I think I should be skeptical of, I will then investigate their base claims to see whether or not I find them believable. I will do a little bit of research. Now, depending on the person and the claim, will depend on the depth of my research. Sometimes these are things that I quite enjoy looking up, and I'll deep dive into them, and I'll do, a dozen links to various sources, and I'll write paragraph after paragraph because I'm pulling a lot of this stuff right off the top of my head. Like, oh, I remember reading that. Let me go grab that. I'll get you the direct source, and then I'll write my thinking on it. What I have found is that a lot of typically religious people or typically conservative people is that's not quite how they arrive at the same conclusion. More that their various, and I'm going to use a loose interpretation of the word here, their preacher of their group or whatever thought leader that they have adopted or subscribed to will say that this group of people or this organization or something is untrustworthy. Typically because they said a bad thing about me or my team, therefore they're wrong. An example, and I'm not trying to get into the weeds here, so please, I'm just using an example here. What I have seen a lot from a lot of conservative people that I know in real life is that they will go after places like CNN or the Washington Post or something like that because of a perceived liberal bias. And when I ask them, when I investigate, what do you think this bias is? How do you think it affects their reporting? Because I can totally understand that there's a bias in the media, but I think that has a lot more to do with capitalism and rich people wanting to be richer than it does a lot else. But I ask them, why do you think this is? And typically the response is, well, they've said a lot of bad things for a really long time about this person I really like, and therefore they must be wrong. And I'm not trying to characterize them or defame them or, put up a straw man or anything like that. I'm trying to genuinely represent the conversations I've had with many of these people. And I've come to realize that I think it's more of the different ways we view the world. So, for me to start a conversation already thinking that the source of this information is sketchy is because I have to have interacted with that source of information before. And I remember, oh, actually, they posted a story a few months ago, but it was proven wrong or to be a lie or to be an exaggeration a few days later. And then they did it again and again and again. They keep being proven wrong. These people have a history of telling lies or mistruths, sometimes on subjects that I've researched. And we've had conversations like this before where I've told you, hey, this person got this thing drastically wrong, or this news story is drastically wrong about XYZ. And then I will then eventually decide, all right, whenever I encounter this news source, I am going to be skeptical of the information that they present me because they have shown a history of unreliability. But with conservative people, it's not so much an argument from evidence as so much as it feels like it's an argument from emotion. You know, they'll be like, I don't like these people, and therefore they then believe that everything from these news sources is colored against them, partially because their news sources or their team, their congregations, their preachers, or their thought leaders will explicitly say that that team is against us, they're bad, they'll do anything they can to destroy us. And they'll typically use pretty violent language to churn up fear, even if it is subtly. It's definitely present for someone like me who kind of notices that stuff, because paying attention to the language people use to describe other people is an interest of mine. I just find it kind of cool. Or at least, I don't know, I pay attention to it. So what I was talking about is that the different ways that people will view and interact with their media and with news sources, trusting them or not trusting them, is someone like me will typically require a couple layers of evidence to believe XYZ before actually fully accepting it. And there are sources that have proven multiple times before to be reliable, that we're more likely to see as reliable the next time they come out with a piece of information, even if I might, have an emotional disagreement or reaction to it. I would think, they've been good at relaying information before, reliable and accurate. So even though I don't like this piece of information, the likelihood of it being true are higher than it otherwise would be, and thus it is more worth my time to investigate this claim to confirm it to be true from other alternate sources. And that's something I just typically look for. Look for more than one source saying the same thing. If they're consistent in what they're saying, then the likelihood of it being true independently of each other goes up. One person or one source saying one crazy thing is one thing, but when the more people you get reporting the exact same thing, you get to see a pattern emerge. And obviously that system is just a general rule of thumb. You can't go by the crowd's consensus, but typically, especially in journalism or science, the consensus is what you go with, because the consensus has been tested by the maximum number of people. And so then the outliers are then typically doubted more. Why are you disagreeing with the crowd? With the consensus of the scientific, journalistic, or medical community? You must have some extremely good reasons, and that will require investigation and review. And thus, you then should be doing your best to gain the consensus of the group, not revel in their rejection of you. That's usually a red flag, I see. If you reject the consensus of scientists, journalists, or the consensus of doctors, the possibility of you being a crank or just out of your mind goes way up, But also what these two groups see as reliable sources is vastly different. So someone like me will look for multiple articles or studies or research papers to demonstrate what I'm saying is true. I look for the experts on the subject in the field that the discussion is being had, and I look from more than one instance of that work being done that is relevant to whatever I'm talking about, so that I can build a large body of references for whatever I'm saying to back up whatever arguments I am making. Whereas with typically religious people or conservative people that I know in my personal life, they'll typically refer to a sermon or some sort of uh, variation of a sermon, I guess could be said. You know, just because it comes from a Fox News show doesn't make it much less of a sermon functionally for these people, because not a lot of sources are cited there, but instead it's instead charismatic speakers, thought leaders, projecting strong, fortified thoughts with a lot of emotional language and punch into the speeches that feel right, you know. And that's why a lot of conservative media usually pivots around the morality of something rather than the science of something. Uh, Not only because they often find themselves in conflict with the scientific consensus or medical consensus or journalistic consensus, um, but because it is much easier to get conservative people, to ignore the consensus of science or medicine or journalism if instead they can get them to attack the character of scientists or atheists, um, so as to create an excuse to dismiss them. So they don't like us. We don't have to listen to them. They're trying to attack us because this charismatic thought leader that we keep following and investing so much of our emotion into them is being attacked by these people, being called a liar or any number of derogatory names. And while to people like me, or to people who look for more pattern and observations to build our perceptions of reality, uh, saying something, and again, I'm only using an example here, saying something like Orange Man bad for XYZ reasons makes perfect sense. And the fact that it has to be said so often just means that this source of information needs to be cited again, or there is something to add to the ever growing pile of information we have on this subject. So, this person lied about XYZ. Okay, add that piece of information to the pile. They exaggerated ABC. All right, add that to the pile. And it goes on and on. And the fact that it has to be brought up so much is just, hey, he's, Orange Man has said a new thing. Look at this pile of evidence we have that they are an unreliable narrator of information. Maybe don't believe what they are saying now. But that is not how typically a religious person, I have found, absorbs that information, because they're not typically used to interacting with the world in that way. That's not the way their communities, that's not the way their friends talk to them. Their friends, their communities, and their thought leaders, especially, do not talk about a body of evidence to prove a thing. They will sometimes, their thought leaders will cosplay, they will dress up in the idea that they are actually in search of evidentiary things, of a body of proofs. But when you start to break down their language and what they use as examples, you typically find their claims to be skeptical or purely scientific to be fraudulent. And it's pretty easy for someone like me to really pick that apart. Like, it's blatantly obvious when someone who does not understand what they are talking about, or has only read the metaphorical headline of a scientific research paper or a field of study, and they only know the basic minimums, and they are running off of that and still misread the title, it's really obvious, because someone like me will go, that doesn't sound right, and you've been wrong before, so I'm just going to quickly look up that paper and spend 2-3 minutes reading through it and realize that is not even close to what that paper says, or what that study has found, or what a dozen other studies have found. So one really great example of this that I'll think of off the top of my head is that they'll typically go for the token example X. So within conservative media, they will point to one or maybe even two, if they're really lucky, one or two outlier cases of a consensus. So the vast majority of scientists say that the Earth is flat, that you should wash your hands to prevent germs, and wear a mask to prevent the spread of coronavirus. But if they can find just one crank who's managed to pay for a fake degree, or maybe if they're really, really lucky, they've got a real degree, but have just lost any sense. I shouldn't mock. I'm not trying to mock. If they find one outlier from the consensus, they will then prop up that outlier and then turn to everyone else or people like me. And they will hold this person, this outlier from the consensus, and they will say, "What you tell us to believe, doctors and scientists and experts in their fields. Here is one of those. We managed to catch one in the wild." I'm being insulting. I shouldn't do that. We have this expert in the field, and they say that you are wrong. Why do you then not believe them? Now, through my discussions, I think I have a theory in why they do this, and it's tying back to the first thing that I was talking about earlier, is that a conservative person goes typically to a church, or nowadays to their thought leaders or their communities, whether that be on the TV or on their computers or at church, and they will go and they will have a lesson preached to them, and then they will accept that as their daily or weekly lesson that they take on a basis of faith. And that's usually what makes them more vulnerable to people who exploit people who accept things on faith, rather than people like me who accept things on evidence and will argue with a con man over the details of the con. Because you're not really supposed to argue at church with the preacher, but scientists are, by design, arguing with each other all the time to find the most correct answer. You don't see mathematicians arguing over the answer of 2 plus 2, but you will find any number of preachers arguing over the meaning of a specific verse. And so when conservative people hold up an outlier from the consensus, they believe that they have found the right preacher to teach the right message to the lost sheep of the world. And that's kind of that's why they often pester me so much on being an atheist or holding XYZ opinions, is they think that if they can just find the right sermon to touch me emotionally, like they have been touched emotionally, and they felt the truth, or the belief of what they think is the truth, enter their hearts, they think they can get to me in that same fashion. They're just taking their own lived experiences, and they then assume that other people will react in a similar fashion, as everyone that they know also reacts in a similar fashion. So they go to someone like me and they say, "We have found a preacher for this idea that we hold dear, or that, sorry, we have found a preacher, a prophet, that is teaching the same lessons that I have learned amongst my, and I'm using this loosely here, my church. Why do you then not accept the lessons from your prophet or your preacher? Is he not amongst the? Is he not from your congregation or your religion, which is to say, science, medicine, whatever? What they don't understand is, or no, not understand. They're not stupid. They're just thinking about the world in a different way than I am. And I don't want to mock people for that. And I'm trying to get out of the habit of ever doing that. Because my goal is not to mock people. It is to understand them better and to help them understand me. But where I hold my disagreements with them is the fact that because they're holding up an outlier, they've only managed to find one, maybe two people who disagree from the consensus, shows the strength of the consensus. And to them, that seems like a church purging itself of heretics. You know, you're teaching a false religion and therefore we will go after you. It's what they do. It's what they understand. That happens in their own experience. You know, I've had conversations with religious people who will vehemently go after other religious people because those religious people do not conform to their views. And so they then transfer that mode of thinking over to the scientific community or the medical community. And they think, if this person is saying something different from the consensus, they must just be persecuted because they believe a different thing. And belief is kind of the operative word there. It's kind of the operative idea of this entire thing. A foundation of belief or taking in information on faith versus a tendency to take things in on evidence or estimations of reliability of presenting evidence. So, you know, if the CDC puts out a paper saying, you know, hey, wear masks, that's kind of important, you know, and wash your hands, make sure to do that too. I'm probably going to listen to them because those are the experts on the subject, even if I myself do not have the medical degree nor the fucks to give to do the research to prove that washing my hands does in fact kill 99% of germs. They are a reliable source and they know what they're talking about, and so I can take them on faith. I can believe them to have evidence. But that use of the word faith, as indicated by my air quotes, is radically different than how a religious person uses the word faith. So when a religious person uses the word faith, they're talking about belief without proof. Whereas when I was using the word faith, it's more akin to, I believe that the CDC will, if asked, if pressed, will provide me all of the information and the research to prove that washing my hands does in fact kill germs and wearing a mask does in fact slow the spread of coronavirus. The only thing stopping me from holding that information in my hands is my willingness to read all of the research they have gathered and have readily available and have then used to make this recommendation. That is not the same thing as when a religious person believes on faith of something. Because if you ask a religious person or a thought leader or a preacher of some kind, if you ask them to provide evidence for their faith-based claims, they will inevitably come up short, because that is not the foundations of their beliefs. Their beliefs are rooted in faith, in the belief without proof, not. I hope I'm being clear. I'm trying to be clear, and it's kind of messing up the way I usually talk because I'm trying to speak clearly. When your typical conservative or religious person, your layman, right, your average Joe, when they take something on faith from their preacher, that's not the same thing as when I take something on faith from the CDC or from NASA or from a history book or something like that, or a research paper. Because when I'm told by something by those groups of people, I can be sure that research has been done, evidence has been produced, and is presentable, even if I am too dumb or too tired to read all of it. And I will just go, all right, I'm pretty sure I know you know what you're talking about, because you can prove you know what you're talking about. Whereas when a religious person takes something on faith from a preacher or a thought leader or something like that, there's not really that understanding that if pressed, hard evidence will be revealed, and just if pressed, I must be attacking them or angry at them, you know? Like if I press a scientist and I say, hey, I want you to explain in depth X, Y, Z, they can do it. They can point to the research papers, they can point to the evidence, they can point to the studies, and they can typically explain in much bigger words than I can understand exactly why and how we know a thing. But when you and they're usually typically happy to do it unless you're interrupting something. Usually scientists are happy to share the science that they have because they want everyone to know this information. But when you press a religious person on their claims about the world, they get angry, because when you're asking questions, um, they feel like you're attacking them. And I have had many conversations with many religious people, and I'll even tell them in advance, I'm not trying to mock you, I'm not trying to get in a fight with you, but I do want to really dig down, and I want you to give me some answers to these hard questions. And even when I would ask preachers, they wouldn't really be able to provide satisfactory answers, because um, they would go about the conversation as, oh, I need to give a mini sermon to this one person, but I will talk to them like I talk to an entire congregation, and I'll just tailor my language to the individual. But that's not what I'm doing, and they always, despite me trying to clarify, they tend to seem to misunderstand um, my goals, because they're thinking about it differently. So when I'm asking questions and I'm asking them, produce evidence for this, explain this, this doesn't match up with this, what has been said before does not match up with what is being said now, XYZ, I am investigating a series of claims made by their religion. And again, I'm using that in a really broad sense to just say basically any belief that a religious or a conservative uh, person holds, or really anyone who will take anything on faith. Anyone who will take anything on faith, when I am asking them to explain their views, to explain their thought process, and to provide evidence for it, provide hard lines of reasoning. Why do you believe what you do? When they come up short, they get frustrated very easily, and they get angry at me for asking because it feels like I'm attacking them, because they're trying to teach a sermon to the crowd. They're trying to preach to the chorus, and the chorus is not singing along. Instead, I'm interrupting, you know, and I'm saying, "Hey, uh, that doesn't make sense. Will you please explain further or more technically, or provide evidence for what you are saying?" And when you deal with people who take things on faith and they are talking and trying to explain uh, things that they've taken on faith, uh, they will eventually hit a limit where they have to finally say out loud that they've taken something on faith, on belief without proof. And at the very bottom, at the very center of what they're talking about, what they believe in, that's they don't have proof for it. They don't have. Uh, they have the they have the answers that they built their conclusions around, and they went looking for evidence for. But people like me, where we say no, we need the evidence, and then when we've built the evidence up high enough, we can then reach for answers, but only when they directly come from the evidence. And that's usually the heart of the conflict, and it's also why a lot of those people have such a hard when I have such a hard time talking to them about unreliable sources of information. Because when they talk about an unreliable source of information, they're talking about an other on the attack of their team. When I talk about an unreliable source of information, it's usually their thought leaders or their preachers of any stripe, because there's not enough evidence to support the claims their thought leaders or preachers make. Uh, and I think that's all I have to say on the subject. I think I've rambled or uh, repeated myself in one way or another multiple times. Um, so that's gonna be all. It was like 4 in the morning when I started this. Um, so that's that. Let's go.